If anybody's followed this channel for a relatively long time, you might catch me uploading a Resident Evil related video here and there. It is mostly just playthroughs of me playing the old school games though. I am an old school Resident Evil fan. I enjoy all of the old games mostly. The original trilogy mostly as well. OG4 and Code Veronica. In fact, I'd probably go out on a limb and say my favourite Resident Evil is still to this day probably Code Veronica. I enjoy everything about the old school versions of the games, how they play, how they feel, combat, environment, music, all of that stuff. I don't really enjoy the newer Resident Evil games. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not somebody who's here to tell people what Resident Evil games they should like or anything. I am one of these Resident Evil fans from the past that basically look at the series like the series has moved on to appeal to a wider audience now, and this happens with lots of series. Whenever a new Resident Evil game comes out, I always say first and foremost that I would rather have new people enjoy it over me, because I am glad that the series still lives on and I have the older games that I like and I still play to this day and still enjoy to this day. That being said, every time a new Resident Evil game gets announced, or rumoured, I cannot help but get a little bit carried away at the possibilities that they might do something that might intrigue myself. I buy every Resident Evil game still, I still support the franchise, I still play all the new games at least once. Whether I enjoy them is a different story. But along comes the announcement of Resident Evil 4 Remake suddenly. And I could not help but think negatively right off the bat, I'll be brutally honest. I was definitely in the camp where I thought that Resident Evil 4 did not need a remake in the first place, and the original still aged pretty well, to the point where, why do we need a remake in this game? It still feels pretty good anyway. Then I started thinking a wee bit more clearly about it, and if there is one of the older games that I don't get on with as much anymore in this day and age, it's definitely the original Resident Evil 4 for me. I'm one of these people that think the original Resident Evil 4 was fantastic at the time, but over the 18 years between now and the game's release, it kinda got a bit stale as it's went on. Resident Evil 4 Original is definitely a fantastic game and has a bit of everything for everyone. It's got a perfect beginning, a great middle, and a pretty bad end though, let's be honest. At least for myself, I don't think the island is a fun part of the game anymore. I think the village is the best part of the game, and I think the castle is the second best part of the game. Mostly because they still have a bit of horror atmosphere going on in it. So yeah, when you really sit down and think about what they could change with an RE4 remake, it's kind of like, how could they make it any worse? Surely they can just make it better. If they just literally focus on making the island part better, then we've got a better game, maybe by default, because RE4 is already a really good game and has all the groundwork laid out for them. Is it a better version of RE4 though? That's like the hardest question to answer. I don't think I can straight up say that it's a better version of RE4. It's definitely not a worse version of RE4. It's somewhere in between, and I think that is actually what the developers wanted you to see when playing this game. They wanted you to see an alternate take on what RE4 could have been, but it still somehow feels similar. So similar, in fact, that 5 minutes in the first village area, I'm running the same routine I would be as if playing the original. Running into the house to trigger the fight with the Dr. Salvador, going upstairs, grabbing a shotgun, getting the grenade. It all feels so similar, but like completely different because the game's had a complete makeover. Only then to make it to the next area, which somehow looks the same but completely different as well, because it's got new buildings added and even got new enemy types. Even the treasure is somehow in the same area, but no really. And that's a good way of explaining what the game is. There's no other way to really put it. It's kinda similar, but different. Some areas are completely flipped around just to give returning players a new feel for the areas that they've been in for 18 years if they're still playing the game. I beat the game in 27 hours for my first playthrough. That's how much I was obsessed with seeing every single part of the old game being reimagined. The original Resident Evil 4 is not necessarily a scary game per se, and what I mean by that is, like, the thought of the game is scary though, and adds to the atmosphere. In the original game, there's a couple of areas that add to the atmosphere. First, when you go into that shed and you see the mutilated carcass of the woman on the wall, which is not here in the remake, but it's made up by other things. It all adds to the atmosphere of the game. There's a specific part in the original game as well, where there is clearly a sacrificial altar, and we never really get to see what happened there. The remake opens up with showing you that an actual sacrifice happens there, and I appreciate it because it adds to the overall atmosphere of the remake and being a little bit more scary. And one of the reasons I took so long in my first playthrough is I wanted to see everything, and there's so many more little areas where they add to that, where they have clearly captured people from the woods and killed them, and it shows you this in the game, and it adds to the atmosphere of the remake, and I, for one, really appreciate it, because I like adding to the atmosphere of Resident Evil 4. It's not necessarily a scary game, but the thought of it is, and the remake does that better than the original, in my opinion. I have to say, I think the gunplay in the game is fantastic. Like, I genuinely don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just think fighting all the enemies is addicting. It's amazing how satisfying it is just shooting any weapon in this game and always that's what honestly kept me playing it. I played this game like 10 times in a row, I think, and I was never once bored of the gameplay, man. Never once bored of the gameplay, and that is because of how finely tuned the gameplay is in this game. It just feels so satisfying pulling the trigger of any one of these weapons. I appreciate that there's so many weapons to use on every playthrough. The bad side though, and I do have to bring it up, is that there does seem to be like a set group of weapons that are the best to use, and there's almost like no point in using any of the other ones. The main ammo that's going to drop in the game is handgun ammo. You are very rarely going to get any other ammo type like TMP, and when you do get stuff like shotgun shells and stuff like sniper rifles, you're mostly making them, and you're lucky if you get a wee drop on them. You cannot like do a playthrough with the TMP as your main weapon in this game like you could in the original, because the original dropped so much ammo. There's a completely different take on the new game in terms of like what weapons they want you using, and they want you using a handgun. I don't necessarily think it's like the worst thing ever to do this, because I think if you were using like a TMP all the time, maybe the game would be like too easy. I don't know. I don't know what they could have done to balance this, but it does render some weapons obsolete. Weapons like the TMP you just don't find yourself using. Even the Striker is nowhere near as good as the Riot Gun shotgun. The Riot Gun shotgun is just better. It's the same with the sniper rifle. The Stingray, which is the second one you get, is not as good as the first sniper rifle that you get, I don't think. Because of the exclusive upgrade, it just does stuff like straight up more damage, so there's no real reason not to use the first one over the second one. And also the assault rifle that you get later, which also uses sniper rifle ammo, which you really want to use for your real sniper rifle, so it kind of renders that gun obsolete as well. The good thing is, you can usually like do a new playthrough with any one of the pistols. I don't think there's any single handgun that is the best. I don't know though, it's hard to say. I think the Punisher is up there as one of the more better ones because of stuff being able to use the laser sight on those pistols, which you cannot use on the Red Knight. But also the base handgun that you get, because it's the first handgun you get, you might be upgrading that first, so it kind of like leads into that being more powerful than the rest of them too, like in terms of price for performance ratio, you know? I'm going to segment into something else here while talking about the gameplay, and that is just how the game functions overall. How random the enemies are in this game. I love it, and it reminds me of stuff like the original Resident Evil 3, where like every playthrough you do, something different can happen. Resident Evil 4 Remake has this function, and it has it with its enemies, because you can get grabbed off screen by some random dude that you didn't even know was there. Like, these motherfuckers have actual GoldenEye teleportation strats, and I love it. I don't care if it kills me, because it adds to the overall fun of the game. But this game's getting a bit of a negative reputation with some people that like to do their challenge runs, like no damage runs. These runs are all over YouTube for newer games these days, and a lot of people are angry at this game because the game is not letting them do stuff like their challenge runs for no damage due to how random it is. And they are like telling Capcom, fix this issue, do this and that, and I cannot disagree more with this take. I think if you have such a game set in stone, you have no replayability. Nothing at all, because it's always going to wind up the same every time you play that. But people who like doing challenge runs, no damage, etc., they like that it's this way all the time, but that's what they like. That's no like what a lot of the gaming population-like, and every time I turn Resident Evil 4 on, something different can happen with literally one of these enemies, and that's what makes that playthrough unique, and it adds to the overall playtime that I'm going to have with the game. I love it. I would really like to hear what people think about this particular aspect, because I think it's a positive in line for Resident Evil 4 Remake, not a negative, and I hope that Resident Evil 9 has this. I do, because I think it adds to the fun factor, the comedic factor of the game, everything like that. And if Resident Evil 9 comes out and its enemies are dumb as shit, it's not going to be anywhere near as fun. That is honestly like how I feel about that factor. I do have to bring up an aspect to the game as well, which was pretty praised by a lot of critics. For me, I'm somewhere indifferent on it. I like the idea more than the execution. When we first came up for the side quests that are in the game, it tells us to kill 3 rats. I was like, cool, this is a good idea. I like that we can do this, and we get rewards for it. I also like the fact that there's little mini bosses, quote unquote, in the game. The bad side of it is, did we really need to kill 9 rats? Why did they make us redo the same side quests? Like I say, I like the idea of it more than the execution. I don't think we should have been killing 9 rats. Leave it at 3, so it doesn't outstay its welcome. But it does outstay its welcome. When it comes to the little mini boss types, like killing the dog, killing the extra armor knight in the castle, I like the idea of it as well, but I would have much preferred if they were actual mini-bosses, not just a more uber version of already existing enemies, because that is essentially what they were. These things could have been done better in my opinion. It's cool that they dabbled with them, but I have to say this. If they are looking to try open world horror one day for a Resident Evil game, we need a little bit better going on than just killing rats. What I did like about the game was some of the more open areas that we could explore, like the lake. There was far more areas to explore there, more treasure to grab in a lot of these areas than there was in the original game. That is stuff that we should be feeding back to Capcom. Yes, we want that. We want that for whatever open world Resident Evil game you're going to be making. I don't want to kill 9 rats though. I think enemy designs in this game are absolutely fantastic, and it's some of Capcom's best work in a while. I think the Ganados, the generic Ganados look amazing. The buffed up Ganados look great. Like I was saying, the Bella sisters look amazing. Krauser, Ada Wong, Salazar. Everybody says Salazar looks like this little old woman. I could not disagree more. I think he looks great, even more creepy, and they added to his character. I think if there's any enemy, in my opinion, which genuinely looks worse, it's probably the Regenerators. I think the Regenerators look scarier in the original over the remake. I think in the remake they just don't look good. You know, I think that's one area where they kind of like failed on the enemy design there. But I hear it, some people like them, some people don't. I'm definitely in the camp where I think the Regenerators look worse. I also still don't know what Capcom's obsession with hats is, so they put a hat on the big cheese in this game when he never had one originally. That's fine, I guess. But overall, I think the enemy designs look amazing. My favourite enemy design is probably... it's probably the Garradors. That room where you met the double Garradors was one of the highlights of the entire game, and I was actually a little bit scared in there, but it was sick. The boss fights in the game are okay. I don't think they're the best part of the game anyway. I don't think they were the best part of the original game either. So any improvement is good improvement, in my opinion, when it comes to the boss fights. Mendez he's kind of similar to the original. It's no that different. It's still a equally okay boss fight. I think the boss fight with Salazar is the best fight in the game. Yes, I do. If you don't use the golden egg cheese, but I do think it's the best boss fight in the game, fighting Salazar in this one. Verdugo, don't even get me started on the new boss fight with him. I think it's... I should not be able to run round a bloody obstacle for 5 minutes and avoid the boss fight entirely. Capcom, please do not do that in the next Resident Evil games. Please force people to fight a boss, for God's sake, because if people can find stuff like this, they're gonna use it Sadler though, I still don't think his boss fight's even that good, especially because we could still one-hit kill it with a rocket launcher. But to be fair, I think the original was never that intriguing in the first place, and I still think with a remake it's still not just that good a boss fight anyway. They did remove U3. They did. I don't care. I don't think the boss fight was all that good in the original anyway, and I think removing it here is no that big a deal either. I think the more mini-boss fights in the game are better. Things like fighting the double Garradors, things like fighting the Bella Sisters. Let me know what you think about that, but that's kind of what I'm leaning towards with the remake. The story of RE4, it was never really like an amazing story in the first place. I mean, like, I think when Shinji Mikami says that he made the story up in 2 weeks, you can see it. You know what I mean? It's not really got much going on. I think he said himself that if he wanted the game to be remade one day, he wanted them to improve the story. I don't think the overall story of Resident Evil 4 is that improved in the remake. It is still very much Leon saves the president's daughter. And you cannot do much more with that story in the first place. But one thing that they did add on to was character development. Leon is far better in terms of character development. Ashley as well, I think. The main character that improves from it a lot is probably Luis. He has added a lot more stuff in the game, and I think, I don't want to spoil the game or anything for people who no played it. It's only a couple of months old anyway, a few months old. So like, what I do like though is how much they changed Luis. He's got far more going on in the game than he ever did in the original, and they actually make you feel for that character, which is great. Salazar, I wish they'd done a wee bit more with Salazar and people like Mendez, the big cheese. But at the end of the day, I think like there's a bit of that leave the audience wanting more. So I don't think Capcom wanted to do too much more. You never know what might have like crossed the boundary of going into comedic with these characters, when at least we're left wanting more from them. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's a good touch. Leave it like that. I know there was a lot of controversy around Ada Wong. I have absolutely no issues. I thought it's a good thing that there was a wee bit less Ada Wong in the remake than there was in the original, because it's not really a story about Ada Wong, it's more about Leon and Ashley. So I preferred it more that they focused on them. But I liked Ada's character in this game, but I don't really want to talk too much about like the voice acting and stuff like that, but I'll swear I never had a problem with this voice acting for Ada Wong, and it's maybe because I was never a big fan of Ada Wong in the first place. I'm not Ada Wong's biggest fan in the series anyway, so I don't really like have this checklist of when I see Ada Wong that she needs to be like this, this, and this. She was fine for me. When it comes to Krauser, I think he was a bit of a downgrade in terms of character. I much preferred how he sounded in the original, a bit more gritty and stuff like that. Overall, I feel like he was a bit more, didn't he feel as threatening in the remake as he did in the original. I genuinely think Sadler's one of the worst bosses ever. I don't think there's too much you can do with Sadler. He's just a cult leader at the end of the day, and I don't think Capcom, I don't think they even really tried with a remake version of him. He's still just like what he was even in the original. You can't do much with him. It's a wee bit of a bummer that they couldn't think of more to do with Sadler, yes, but at the end of the day, I don't necessarily blame Capcom in the remake for like no trying to do more with him. It's like, okay, we'll just leave him, we'll try and improve the other characters a wee bit, you know, and I think they succeeded there. So what is it about Resident Evil 4 Remake then that makes me like it? Somebody who's no liked a Resident Evil game since the original Resident Evil 4. I mean, I don't even really get on with Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's no my cup of tea. I don't get on with Resident Evil 3 Remake, Village, 7, they're just not my kind of Resident Evil games that I like. It's not what I got into the series for in the first place. What makes Resident Evil 4 Remake good is actually because it's a remake of an already over-the-shoulder, action-orientated Resident Evil already. It's just a more up-to-date version of it. Resident Evil 4 already exists. Its environments were made with over-the-shoulder gameplay in mind. Its enemies were made with over-the-shoulder gameplay in mind. The Ganados lend themselves to over-the-shoulder gameplay far more than zombies ever will. Zombies are slow. That is what I don't think works for over-the-shoulder Resident Evil 2 Remake, 3 Remake and stuff. But I think it works by default with Resident Evil 4 because that's what they were envisioned with. These enemies were made with this gameplay in mind. The environments were made with this gameplay in mind. These open environments, it's all there. The bosses were made with it too. So it just lends itself to this kind of game by default. And I think that is one of the reasons why I like it the most. And I'll tell you something, Capcom went all out on the gunplay with this remake. It just shows how good Resident Evil 4 is by default, that all it really needs is a bit of an update with modern gameplay, and it's just as addicting as it ever was in the first place 18 years ago. Overall, I absolutely love this Resident Evil remake. But I cannot help but be like, is this maybe the only remake that I'm gonna like? Is this one of the only newer Resident Evil games that I'm gonna like? Will I actually like Resident Evil 9? Does it make me excited for Resident Evil 9? It really remains to be seen. I don't know the answer. I think maybe, like I'm saying, the reason I like Resident Evil 4 Remake is because it's just a better version of Resident Evil 4 and a different version of it. But with Resident Evil 9, they'll be doing new things, and what if I don't like these new things? Like what I was touching on earlier, I really want them to do an open world Resident Evil horror experience. Open world. I think we need it. I think Resident Evil 4 Remake dabbled with this, as you can see from the side quests that we talked about, the backtracking that we talked about, the more open areas with the treasures that we talked about. It's all here. It's all there for them to do an open world Resident Evil experience. Will it come with Resident Evil 9? I don't know. It doesn't really matter though. What matters is the here and now. The fact that I actually like another Resident Evil game. And it took 18 years. 18 years for me to like one. But thank you very much, Capcom, for giving me another amazing Resident Evil experience. And I'm not shilling, because if I was shilling, there would be like Resident Evil 7 and 8 and everything under the sun videos on this channel for like easy views. But yeah, thank you very much for giving me a great Resident Evil experience. And I got a wee honorary mention here in the script that I've still not talked about, which is actually thank you as well for putting in a little nod to the small keys that are in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Those felt like they were there for the old school fans, because Resident Evil 4 Original doesn't even have small keys. And I think if they were including small keys or anything like that, they would have just used lockpicks from Resident Evil 7 and 8 to make it go into their newer world of the newer games easier, if you know what I mean. But no, they chose to put a reference that's not been in since the original Resident Evil 2, and they chose to put it in this new remake of theirs in the form of small keys. And Tasty Mond really appreciates it. Thank you very much. That's just a wee something I wanted to add in because it's a big deal to some old school fans, I think. But yes, thank you once again for a fantastic Resident Evil game. And even if I don't end up liking Resident Evil 9 or Resident Evil 5 Remake or whatever's coming next, or Code Veronica Remake, it doesn't matter. The fact is that this game exists and it's as good as it is. Thank you to everybody who supported me while we were playing this game on Twitch and some of the videos that I made for it, the S Plus Pro rank run that I'd done. I'm very proud of it. Thank you very much. And if anybody watches this video, thank you very much too. Let me know what you thought about Resident Evil 4 Remake, dudes. I would honestly give it a 9 out of 10. No game's a 10. 9 out of 10. And that's a big deal from me. It's definitely my game of the year. Take it easy. Thanks for watching.